700 miles of fault line, 326 years of silence, 8 million people living above a place most of them barely think about, and buried in the record of the Earth, 41 major earthquakes over the last 10,000 years. That is Cascadia. Most Americans have heard about the San Andreas Fault. They know California shakes. They have seen the movies, the cracked highways, the disaster scenes, the big Hollywood version of an earthquake. But Cascadia is different. It is quieter. It is farther offshore. It does not sit in the national imagination the same way. And maybe that is what makes it so dangerous. Cascadia runs under the Pacific Ocean, from Northern California all the way up to Vancouver Island. It is not just a crack in the ground. It is a subduction zone. That means one massive plate is slowly sliding under another one. But here is the part that should make people stop. Those plates are not sliding smoothly. They are locked. They have been locked since the year 1700. Every year, pressure keeps building, inch by inch, quietly, patiently, no sirens, no countdown clock, no warning sign on the beach that says, "This coast is storing one of the biggest earthquakes in North America." And yet, that is exactly what is happening. Cascadia is the only fault system in the continental United States capable of producing an earthquake above magnitude 9. Not a regular earthquake. Not the kind that knocks dishes off shelves and cracks a few walls. A magnitude 9 event is a different kind of disaster. It can shake for minutes, not seconds. It can drop parts of the coastline. It can push the ocean into a wall of water. And for some coastal towns, that wave could arrive before people even understand what has happened. The strange thing is, this is not some wild theory. Cascadia has done this before. The land remembers it. The ocean floor remembers it. Dead forests along the coast remember it. Even records from Japan remember it. But for a long time, America acted like silence meant safety. No written record in English, no big story passed down in school textbooks. No famous disaster date that every kid learns. So the danger stayed in the background. Cities grew, roads were built, ports expanded, bridges went up. Millions of people moved into the region and built their lives there. Seattle, Portland, Tacoma, Olympia, coastal towns across Oregon and Washington. Life went on, and underneath it all, Cascadia stayed locked. That is the part that is hard to sit with. A threat can be real, even when it is quiet. A fault can be dangerous, even when nobody is talking about it. And a coastline can look peaceful while the ground beneath it is slowly bending under pressure. So, the real question is not just, will Cascadia break again? Science already points in that direction. The real question is this: how did one of the biggest earthquake threats in America stay so unknown for so long? And what has been built on top of it while everyone was busy looking somewhere else? To understand why Cascadia is so dangerous, you do not need to be a geologist. You just need to picture two giant slabs of rock pushing against each other under the ocean. One of them is called the Juan de Fuca Plate. It sits off the Pacific Northwest coast. Slowly, year after year, it is sliding east toward North America. Not fast, only about 1.5 inches a year. That sounds harmless at first. 1.5 inches is nothing. It is about the speed your fingernail grows. You would never feel it. You would never notice it in daily life. But the Earth notices. Because where the Juan de Fuca Plate meets the North American Plate, the movement is not smooth. The plates are supposed to slide past each other. Instead, they get stuck. They lock together. And that is where the trouble starts. The ocean plate keeps trying to move. It does not stop just because the contact zone is jammed. So the pressure has to go somewhere. It bends the edge of North America, little by little, like a wooden ruler being pushed from both ends. For 1 year, that does not sound like much. For 10 years, still not much. But for more than 300 years, that becomes something else. That becomes stored energy. And when rock finally gives way, it does not release that energy politely. It snaps. That is what a subduction zone earthquake is. It is not just the ground cracking. It is a whole section of the seafloor suddenly jumping after centuries of being held down. When that happens, the water above it moves too. And when the ocean moves all at once, it becomes a tsunami. This is not guessing. We have seen this kind of fault do terrible things before. In 2004, a subduction zone earthquake near Sumatra reached magnitude 9.1. The tsunami crossed the Indian Ocean and killed more than 225,000 people across many countries. In 2011, Japan was hit by another magnitude 9.1 earthquake. The wave climbed over seawalls and helped trigger the Fukushima nuclear disaster. Chile, in 1960, had a magnitude 9.5 earthquake, the largest ever recorded by instruments. Its tsunami traveled across the Pacific. Alaska, in 1964, was struck by a magnitude 9.2 quake. In just minutes, parts of the coast changed forever. Different places, different years, same basic engine. A locked subduction zone. Pressure building for a long time. Then, one sudden release. That is why Cascadia matters. It is not dangerous because people are trying to make it sound dramatic. It is dangerous because it belongs to the same family of earthquakes that have already rewritten coastlines, destroyed cities, and sent waves across entire oceans. And right now, Cascadia is still locked, still holding, still storing pressure under a coastline where millions of people live, work, drive, sleep, and raise families. That is the part that makes this feel less like a distant science story, because nothing has to look wrong on the surface for something huge to be building underneath. In 1986, a geologist named Brian Atwater walked into a tidal marsh on the coast of Washington. At first, it did not look like the kind of place that could change how America understood its own earthquake history. It was quiet, muddy, wet, the kind of place most people would pass by without thinking twice. But Atwater noticed something strange. The ground did not make sense. When he pushed a core into the marsh and pulled it back out, the mud came up in layers, and those layers told a story. At the top was dark peat from the living marsh. Under that was a thin layer of clean gray sand. And below the sand was something that should not have been there. Old soil, not ocean mud, not salt marsh soil, real land soil, the kind that forms in a freshwater meadow, above the reach of the tide. It had roots in it, grass roots, tree roots, pieces of a landscape that used to be dry enough for plants to live there. But now it was buried several feet down. That was the first clue. This place had not always been a salt marsh. It had once been higher ground. Then something dropped it down, not slowly, not little by little over centuries. Suddenly, as Atwater kept taking cores along the coast, the same pattern showed up again and again. Living marsh on top, a layer of gray sand, buried old soil underneath. It was like the coastline had been pressed down in one violent motion, and then the ocean rushed in and covered what used to be land. Then came the part you cannot ignore. The dead trees. All through the marsh stood the pale skeletons of cedar trees. Tall, stripped bare, still rooted in the mud. They had not fallen over in a storm. They had not been cut down. They had died, standing. Their roots were sitting in salt water now. But cedar trees do not grow like that. They had once been rooted in dry ground, or at least ground above the normal tide. Then the land dropped, the seawater came in, and the trees were forced to drink salt through their roots. That killed them. And they stayed there, year after year, century after century. A dead forest, standing in plain sight, waiting for someone to understand what it was saying. That is what makes this evidence so powerful. These trees were not just old remains in a swamp. They were witnesses. They were telling us that something massive had happened along the coast, something fast enough to drop the land, strong enough to bring the ocean inland, big enough to kill an entire forest at once. And once you see it that way, the marsh stops looking peaceful. It starts looking like a crime scene. The sand is the trace left by the wave. The buried soil is the land that used to be there. And the dead cedars are the silent witnesses that never left. For a long time, America did not know how to read them. But they had been standing there the whole time, pointing back to the night Cascadia broke. The dead cedars gave Atwater the first big clue. But a clue is not the same as a date. To understand when those trees died, he needed someone who could read time inside wood. That is where David Yamaguchi came in. Yamaguchi was a tree ring specialist. And tree rings are not just lines inside a trunk, they are records. Every year, a tree adds a ring. Some rings are wide, some are narrow, A wet year leaves one kind of mark. A dry year leaves another. Over time, those patterns become like a barcode. If you compare the rings from dead trees with rings from living trees in the same region, you can build a timeline, year by year, season by season. That is what Yamaguchi did. He studied the dead cedars from Willapa Bay. Then he compared them with living cedars nearby, then with trees from other places along the coast. And the pattern kept pointing to the same answer. The last full ring those dead cedars had grown was from the year 1699. That means the trees were alive during the summer of 1699, but they were not alive by the next growing season. So they must have died sometime between late 1699 and the spring of 1700. That may sound like a small detail, but it changed everything. Because this was not one tree. It was not one small patch of forest. Dead cedars along hundreds of miles of coastline were telling the same story. They had all died at about the same time. That is not normal. A bad storm might damage one area. A slow change in sea level might kill trees over many years. Disease might move through a forest unevenly. But this looked different. This looked sudden. The trees were alive. Then the land dropped. Then salt water moved in. Then the forest died. All at once. Still, there was a problem. Tree rings could give the year. They could narrow the window. They could show that something happened around the winter of 1699 to 1700. But they could not give the exact day. They could not say what hour the ground moved. They could not tell whether it happened on a dark night, during a storm, or in the quiet hours after sunset. The wood had said everything it could say. It gave the year. It gave the season. It proved the event was sudden and widespread, but the investigation was not finished. To find the exact moment Cascadia broke, scientists needed another witness. Not in Washington, not in Oregon, not even in North America. The next clue was waiting across the Pacific Ocean, almost 5,000 miles away, in old Japanese records that nobody in America had thought to connect to a dead forest on the Washington coast. And that is where the story starts to feel less like geology and more like a mystery that had been sitting unsolved for nearly 300 years. The dead trees gave scientists the season, but they still did not have the exact date. That answer was not hiding in Washington. It was not buried in Oregon mud. It was sitting on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, in old records from Japan. In the spring of 1700, several coastal villages in Japan wrote down something strange. A wave came in at night. It flooded rice fields. It damaged storehouses. It lifted boats from their anchors. Water kept coming in waves, then pulled back again. But here was the part that confused people. There had been no earthquake in Japan, no strong shaking, no storm, no obvious reason for the ocean to suddenly rise. In Japan, people understood tsunamis. They knew big waves usually came after the ground shook, but this one had no local source. No one felt anything before it arrived. That is why it became known as an orphan tsunami, a wave without a parent. For almost 300 years, those records just sat there. Village notes, damage reports, claims for lost rice, details written down by people who were only trying to explain what had happened to their homes and fields. Then, in the 1990s, a Japanese seismologist named Kenji Satake looked at those records in a different way. He did not treat them like old village stories. He treated them like evidence. The records gave him locations. They gave him wave heights. They gave him timing. So he used a tsunami model and worked backward. Instead of asking, where did the wave go? He asked, where did this wave have to start? That is a very different question. He traced the energy back across the Pacific Ocean, mile after mile, from the coast of Japan toward North America. And the model pointed to one place, the Pacific Northwest. The wave had crossed nearly 5,000 miles of ocean, and to still be strong enough to flood Japanese villages, it needed a massive source. Not a small earthquake, not a local landslide, a magnitude 9 earthquake, or something close to it. Then, Satake looked at the travel time. A tsunami from the Pacific Northwest would take about 9 hours and 40 minutes to reach that part of Japan. So he counted backward from the time the wave arrived. That gave scientists the moment Cascadia broke. Around 9 at night, on the 26th of January, 1700. Think about that for a second. A forest on the Washington coast said the trees died in the winter of 1699 to 1700. Japanese village records said a strange tsunami arrived the next day. A model connected the two across the entire Pacific Ocean. That is what makes this part so powerful. The earthquake left no English newspaper report, no American government record, no settler diary. But it still left a trail. Dead trees on one side of the ocean, flooded rice fields on the other. And almost 300 years later, science finally connected the two. That is when Cascadia stopped being a forgotten possibility. It became a real event, with a date, an hour, and a story that stretched across the world. The dead trees proved Cascadia had broken once. The Japanese records helped put a date and time on it. But there was still one bigger question. Was 1700 just a one-time disaster? Or had Cascadia been doing this over and over again? To answer that, scientists had to stop looking at forests and old papers. They had to look at the bottom of the ocean. That is where Chris Goldfinger comes in. He is a paleoseismologist at Oregon State University. For decades, he studied sediment cores taken from the seafloor off Oregon and Washington. These cores are long tubes of mud pulled up from deep underwater. At first, that may not sound exciting. Just layers of old sediment. Dark bands, light bands, more mud. But those layers are a record. They are the ocean floor's memory. During quiet years, fine sediment settles slowly, layer by layer. Nothing dramatic. But when a huge earthquake shakes the seafloor, something different happens. The shaking can trigger underwater landslides. Sediment from canyon walls breaks loose, rushes downhill, and spreads across the deep ocean floor. When it settles, it leaves behind a dark layer called a turbidite. That dark band is like a fingerprint from a violent event. One band in one canyon might not prove much. Maybe it was a local landslide. Maybe something smaller happened nearby. But Goldfinger and his team did not look at just one canyon. They studied cores from many places along the Cascadia margin. Astoria Canyon, Willapa Canyon, Juan de Fuca Canyon, Rogue Canyon, Mendocino Channel. Then they compared the layers. And that is where it got serious. When the same dark band appeared in different cores from different canyons, at the same point in time, it meant the shaking had not been local. It meant a huge section of the seafloor had moved together. In other words, Cascadia had ruptured, not once, again and again. The record showed 19 full-margin ruptures over the last 10,000 years. That means 19 times when the whole 700-mile fault likely broke in a massive event. And there were 22 more major ruptures in the southern part of the fault. Altogether, scientists found 41 major earthquakes in that 10,000-year record. That number matters, because it tells us Cascadia is not some strange one-off accident from the past. It is a system with a pattern, a long pattern, a dangerous pattern. The youngest dark layer matched the year 1700, the same event found in the dead trees and Japanese tsunami records. That connection is hard to ignore. The forest said it happened, Japan said it happened, and the ocean floor said it had happened many times before. That is the cold truth about Cascadia. It is not sleeping because it is harmless. It is quiet because the pressure is building between events. And the deeper scientists looked, the clearer it became. The 1700 earthquake was not the exception. It was part of the cycle. When people hear the word earthquake, they usually picture a quick shake, maybe 10 seconds, maybe half a minute. The lights swing, dishes fall, everyone freezes for a moment. Then it stops. But a full Cascadia rupture would not feel like that. In the FEMA scenario, Cascadia produces a magnitude 9 earthquake, and the shaking does not last a few seconds. It lasts 3 to 5 minutes. That is hard to imagine until you really sit with it. 5 minutes is a long time when the floor will not stay still. Long enough for people to lose their balance over and over again. Long enough for brick walls to come apart. Long enough for older buildings to fail piece by piece. Long enough for bridges, roads, pipes, and power lines to take damage all at once. Most buildings are not made with that kind of shaking in mind. A lot of construction standards are built around much shorter periods of strong motion. But Cascadia is different because the fault is huge. When a 700-mile section breaks, it does not release its energy in a quick jolt. It keeps going. And while people are still trying to understand what is happening, the coastline itself can change. In a major subduction zone, earthquake, parts of the coast can drop 3 to 6 feet. That means land that was above the tide can suddenly sit much lower. Roads, neighborhoods, beaches, marshes, and low towns can all be changed in minutes. Then comes the water. For coastal communities, the tsunami is the part that leaves almost no room for mistakes. After a full Cascadia rupture, the first wave could reach some nearby towns in 15 to 30 minutes. That is not much time. Not enough time for a clean, organized evacuation. Not enough time for everyone to wait for instructions. Not enough time to pack, search for missing things, call everyone, or sit in traffic. In some places, there may be only one real choice: get to high ground on foot, fast. And that assumes the route is still open. It assumes the road did not crack. It assumes the bridge did not fail. It assumes trees are not down, power lines are not across the street, and people can move in the dark, in the rain, after several minutes of violent shaking. That is what makes the Cascadia scenario so frightening. The earthquake is not one problem. It is the first problem. The shaking damages the roads you need to escape on. It weakens the bridges you need to cross. It knocks out the systems people depend on. Then, before anyone has fully recovered from that, the ocean starts coming in. For people far inland, the shaking itself may be the main danger. But for low coastal towns, the clock starts the moment the ground moves. 15 minutes, 20 minutes, maybe 30 if they are lucky. That is why preparation matters so much here. Not in a vague way, not someday, not as a nice idea, because when Cascadia breaks, people will not have time to figure out a plan for the first time. They will only have time to follow the plan they already know. The real damage from Cascadia would not end when the shaking stops. That is the part people often miss. Yes, the earthquake itself would be deadly. The FEMA scenario talks about roughly 13,000 people killed and about 27,000 injured. Most of those deaths would come from the tsunami, not just the shaking. That number is already hard to take in, but the disaster would keep spreading after the wave. About 1 million people could be displaced. Some homes would collapse, others might still be standing. But that does not mean people could live in them. No clean water, no power, no working sewer system, no fuel, no easy way to leave. That is when a disaster becomes something much bigger than a single event. The Pacific Northwest depends on systems that are all connected. Roads connect hospitals. Bridges connect coastal towns. Ports bring in goods. Fuel depots keep trucks, generators, ambulances, and supply chains moving. But many of those systems sit right in the danger zone. The major ports of Seattle, Tacoma, and Portland are built partly on artificial fill. During long, violent shaking, that kind of ground can liquefy. In plain words, solid ground can start acting more like liquid. That is a nightmare for heavy port equipment, fuel tanks, roads, and container terminals. And those ports are not small local facilities. They are part of the trade system that links the United States with Asia. If they go down, the damage reaches far beyond the coast. Then, there are the bridges. In Oregon alone, officials have estimated that more than 1,000 bridges could collapse or become unusable in a major Cascadia rupture. Some of those bridges are on evacuation routes. Some are the only practical way in or out of certain communities. So imagine trying to escape after the shaking, only to find the road broken or the bridge gone. Now add fuel. The region depends heavily on fuel infrastructure that does not have much backup. One major pipeline feeds much of the Pacific Northwest. If that system is damaged, moving emergency supplies becomes even harder. Generators need fuel. Hospitals need fuel. Fire trucks need fuel. Search and rescue needs fuel. Without it, everything slows down at the worst possible time. And then come the long weeks and months after. The FEMA estimate suggests basic services like water, power, and fuel could take 1 to 3 years to fully recover in some areas. 1 to 3 years. That means this would not just be a bad day. It would change how people live for a long time. Families could be separated, towns could be cut off, hospitals could be overwhelmed. Some coastal communities might not be rebuilt at all. That is why Cascadia is so serious. It is not just an earthquake story, it is an infrastructure story, a supply chain story, a hospital story, a fuel story, a bridge story. The disaster does not end when the ground stops shaking. In many places, that is when the second disaster begins. When the water is gone, when the power is gone, when the roads are broken, and when the places built to help people are damaged too. There was another kind of evidence, not buried in mud, not written in Japanese ledgers, not pulled from the bottom of the ocean. It was carried by people. For generations, native communities along the Pacific Northwest coast had told stories about a night when the earth and ocean changed everything. Ruth Ludwin, a seismologist at the University of Washington, began paying attention to those stories in the late 1990s. She looked at oral traditions from the Coast Salish, the Quileute, the Hupa, the Yurok, the Makah, the Haida, the Huayat, the Toloa, and others. These were not all the same people, not the same language, not the same village. But the stories pointed in the same direction. A winter night, the ground shaking so hard and so long that people could not stand. The ocean pulling back from the shore, farther than anyone had seen before. Then, a wave coming in. Not a normal wave. A wall of water, strong enough to swallow villages, carry away canoes, and drown people who were sleeping in winter houses near the beach. Some stories described it through powerful images, like Thunderbird fighting whale. To outsiders, that sounded like myth. So, for a long time, many people treated it that way. Just folklore, just legend, just old stories. But that was the mistake. Those stories were not trying to be modern science papers. They were doing what human memory has always done. They were preserving a warning in the language people had. A community sees the ocean pull back. It sees the ground shake. It loses homes. It loses families. It loses entire villages. Then the survivors tell their children, and those children tell their children. And the story keeps moving forward, because forgetting it could mean dying the same way again. When Ludwin compared these traditions with genealogy and time markers, they lined up with the same window scientists had already found. The late 1600s. The winter of 1700. The same winter shown by the dead cedars. The same event that sent a tsunami to Japan. That is what makes this part so important. The evidence was never missing. It was there in the forest. It was there in the ocean floor. It was there in Japanese records. And it was there in the memories of native people who had been living on that coast long before modern maps and seismic charts. The problem was not that Cascadia left no warning. The problem was that too many people only trusted one kind of warning. If it was not written in English, they missed it. If it came through oral tradition, they dismissed it. If it sounded like a story, they failed to hear the history inside it. And that may be the deepest lesson here. A disaster can leave evidence everywhere and still be ignored, not because the evidence is weak, but because the people in power do not always know how to listen. In the end, Cascadia is not just a story about earthquakes. It is a story about memory, because the warning was never really gone. It was there in the Japanese village records, where people wrote about a strange wave that came at night with no local earthquake. It was there in the dead cedar forests along the Washington coast, trees that died standing after salt water moved into land that used to be dry. It was there in the dark layers of sediment on the ocean floor, each one marking a time when the seafloor shook hard enough to send mud sliding through underwater canyons. And it was there in the oral traditions of native communities, stories passed down for generations about the ground shaking, the sea pulling back, and a wave swallowing villages. 4 witnesses, 4 different forms of memory: paper, wood, mud, spoken history, all pointing to the same night, the 26th of January 1700. Cascadia had been speaking for a long time. The problem was that America took too long to listen. Some things are better now. There is Shake Alert, a sensor network built to detect the first motion of an earthquake and send warnings before stronger shaking arrives in some places. That can save lives. A few seconds can stop a train. shut off a gas valve, or give someone time to get under a desk. There are hazard maps now. Tsunami zones are marked. Some coastal towns have evacuation signs. Some schools and hospitals have been strengthened. A few vertical evacuation towers have been built so people in flat coastal areas can climb above the wave. These are real steps. They matter, but they are not enough. A few seconds of warning will not evacuate a coastline. A sign on a streetlight will not help if people have never practiced the route. A building retrofit does not protect the bridge next to it. A tower that holds a few hundred people cannot save an entire town. That is the hard truth. Preparedness is not one project. It is a long memory turned into action. It means knowing where to go before the shaking starts. It means building better before the disaster. It means moving critical systems out of the places most likely to fail. It means treating old stories, old trees, old mud, and old records as warnings worth hearing. Because Cascadia will not care whether people were busy. It will not care whether the budget was tight. It will not care whether the last big earthquake felt too far in the past to matter. The plates are still locked, the pressure is still building, and the coastline is still living with a clock it cannot see. So the question is no longer just, when will Cascadia break? The deeper question is this: when it does, what will we have remembered? What will we have strengthened? What will we have moved uphill? What will we have taught our children, written down, practiced, rebuilt, and taken seriously before the ocean comes back? Because the next Cascadia earthquake will not start from zero. The witnesses have already spoken. Now the only question is whether people will listen in time.